On the outskirts of Willow Point, where the fields rolled into the horizon and the town's new developments met the remnants of old farmland, stood a weathered barn that had seen more seasons than any house around it. It was built long before the manicured lawns and HOA board meetings existed, a relic of the land's past, a reminder of when neighbors waved instead of reported. For decades, the barn had been part of the landscape, red paint peeling, roof patched more than once, but solid as the ground beneath it. When storms came, it stood firm. When winds howled across the plains, it barely shuddered. To the man who lived beside it, Eli Turner, that barn wasn't just a structure. It was history, and more importantly, safety. Years ago, after a near miss with a tornado that ripped through the neighboring county, Eli had reinforced the barn's interior with poured concrete walls and a deep storm cellar beneath the foundation. It wasn't just storage anymore. It was a shelter, a place meant to keep him and anyone nearby alive when nature decided to remind people who was in charge. But time had changed Ridgeview Lane. What once was open farmland had become a planned community. The HOA came next, promises of beautification, organization, and safety compliance. What followed was control. Fences had to match. Lawns couldn't be taller than 3 inches. Decorations needed approval. Even the colors of mailboxes were regulated. Eli had no interest in their meetings or their memos. He paid his dues reluctantly, keeping to himself on his edge of the property line. His barn was technically within the HOA's map, though he'd owned it long before they'd even existed. To Eli, that barn was his. To the HOA board, it was an eyesore. They sent letters at first. Polite, almost friendly reminders that the structure at the rear of your property does not meet community aesthetic standards. Eli ignored them. The barn wasn't hurting anyone. He even painted it fresh red, repaired the roof, made it look as neat as he could. But that wasn't what they wanted. The HOA board president, a man named Douglas Hale, loved to remind everyone that Ridgeview Lane was meant to be modern, safe, and uniform. To him, Eli's barn was an embarrassment, a stubborn mark of the past that didn't fit into his vision of neat symmetry and suburban perfection. The first confrontation came quietly. A notice pinned to Eli's door one morning. Final warning, non-compliant structure must be removed within 30 days. Eli didn't respond. 30 days passed. Then another week. Then one morning, the low hum of engines filled the air. Eli stepped outside to see 3 trucks parked along the edge of his property, men in reflective vests unloading equipment. At their front stood Douglas, clipboard in hand, HOA badge glinting under the sun. It didn't matter that Eli had paperwork proving the barn's age or that it had been standing long before the HOA existed. They called it a safety hazard, claiming it could collapse in a storm and endanger other homes nearby. It was a lie built on arrogance, but one the HOA believed. Eli watched, silent, as the demolition crew worked. The wooden beams groaned as they tore through them. The roof fell with a hollow crash. The storm shelter below was sealed off by dirt and debris before he could even protest. By noon, decades of history were gone. Nothing left but dust and a scar of concrete where the foundation had once been. When Douglas shook Eli's hand after, pretending it was a necessary decision, Eli didn't say a word. But deep down, something changed. Something hardened. Summer came slowly that year, heavy with heat and still air. The cornfields beyond the town shimmered under the sun, and the skies turned the kind of blue that made people forget how quickly they could change. Eli worked quietly on his land, clearing debris, tending his small vegetable garden, and saying nothing to the neighbors who pretended not to see what had happened. The HOA congratulated themselves in newsletters, unsafe structure removed for community safety. They even put a line about improved neighborhood value. But Eli noticed something else. When the wind began to shift late that summer, it carried a sound he knew too well. The low rumble that moved beneath the surface, like distant thunder that wasn't quite thunder. The air changed. The light turned strange. The sky, once brilliant, started to bruise at the edges. And Eli knew. The wind was coming back. And this time, there was no barn left to stand between the storm and the people who thought they could control everything. The first signs came quietly, the way danger often does. A stillness that settled over Ridgeview Lane, heavy and unnatural. The kind of silence where even birds stopped their song, and leaves hung motionless in the air. To most of the neighborhood, it felt like an ordinary late summer lull. But to Eli Turner, it was a whisper, a soundless warning carried by memory. He had lived through storms before, the kind that carved through towns and left scars on the earth. He knew that before the skies turned black, before sirens screamed, there was always this, a false calm that stretched just long enough for people to let their guard down. The HOA, of course, didn't notice. Their attention was fixed on planning the Summer Beautification Gala, a neighborhood event filled with decorations, food stalls, and speeches about community spirit. Douglas Hale, ever the self-appointed mayor of the cul-de-sac, was determined to make it perfect. New banners went up on lamp posts, lawns were trimmed to regulation height, and the HOA newsletter proudly reminded residents to keep Ridgeview Lane beautiful. Eli received the invitation like everyone else. He tossed it aside. His focus wasn't on barbecues or banners. He spent his days studying the horizon, scanning the color of the sky, and tracking the subtle shift in the air pressure that pressed against his ears. The meteorologists on local TV began to murmur about a developing storm system in the Central Plains, large, unpredictable, and strengthening faster than expected. But they didn't say the word tornado yet. Not officially. Not until they had to. Eli didn't need to hear it. He could feel it. He began quietly reinforcing his home, boarding up the small storm cellar beneath his kitchen, not nearly as deep or as secure as the concrete shelter that had been buried beneath his demolished barn. He stocked it with supplies, flashlights, batteries, and a weather radio. But even as he worked, he couldn't shake the hollow feeling that he'd lost something irreplaceable. The barn had been his shield. Now it was gone, leveled by people who thought they knew better. Across the neighborhood, laughter and chatter filled the air. Children rode bikes, sprinklers hissed over emerald lawns, and the smell of barbecue drifted from deck to deck. The HOA's world was neat, calm, and perfectly unaware. That evening, as the sun sank low, the horizon took on a strange tint, orange fading to gray, gray darkening into green. The light twisted, reflecting off windows in eerie tones. Eli stood on his porch, watching as the tops of the trees began to shiver. The first gusts of wind arrived like ghosts returning home. By midnight, local news channels interrupted regular programming. Radar scans showed a supercell forming west of the county line, rotating, massive, and gaining speed. The meteorologist's tone had changed. The careful professionalism gave way to urgency. Conditions are right for a tornado outbreak, they warned. Eli barely slept that night. The wind picked up, whistling through the gaps in his fence. Loose shingles rattled. In the distance, thunder rolled like footsteps marching closer. He kept his radio close, listening as warnings shifted from watch to advisory to emergency. The next morning, the sky was dark long before noon. The air tasted of metal and dust. The HOA group chat buzzed with confusion, people asking if the gala should still happen, if the news was exaggerating. Douglas Hale, ever confident, reassured everyone that the storm will pass us by. Eli read the messages without responding. He had heard that same phrase before, years ago, the night the last tornado touched down 2 towns over. People always thought storms passed them by. Until they didn't. By late afternoon, the winds had grown strong enough to bend the young trees along the sidewalks. Garbage bins rolled across the street, and the first sheets of rain came down in sharp, slanting bursts. Still, the HOA refused to cancel the event. They simply moved it indoors, to the community hall, right at the center of the neighborhood. Eli shook his head as he watched cars roll by toward the hall. Balloons fluttered in the wind, banners half-torn but still clinging to fences. Music played faintly through the thickening air. It was surreal, a celebration in the shadow of something enormous and unseen. By dusk, the sirens began. A long, rising wail that cut through the night, the kind of sound that freezes time. The first tornado had touched down west of town, ripping through open farmland and heading straight toward Ridgeview Lane. Inside the community hall, the HOA scrambled, shouting, trying to make sense of it. The power flickered. The music stopped. Outside, trees began to bend as if bowing to the invisible force pushing against them. Eli stepped out onto his porch one last time. He could see the sky split by lightning, each flash illuminating a wall of swirling darkness on the horizon. The tornado was coming, wide, relentless, devouring everything in its path. He closed his door, locked it, and climbed down into his small cellar. The walls trembled as he sealed it shut. The wind screamed now, a constant roar that grew deeper, angrier. He thought of the barn, of the concrete walls that once stood firm. He thought of how it could have protected everyone here if only they hadn't called it a hazard. Then the sound changed. The world above him cracked open with a sound like thunder made of steel. Windows shattered, wood splintered, and something massive tore through the street. Eli clutched his flashlight, breathing slow and steady, as the earth itself seemed to shake. The storm had found Ridgeview Lane, and there was no stopping what came next. The storm struck Ridgeview Lane with a violence that defied imagination. One moment, the neighborhood was a picture of modern perfection. Identical homes lined in rows, windows glowing softly through the dark. The next, that order was torn apart by nature's rage. The tornado didn't announce itself gently. It roared into existence, a colossal column of fury twisting down from the clouds, hungry and alive. The air itself seemed to scream as it touched the ground, pulling earth, metal, and everything in its path into the sky. Eli Turner sat deep in his cellar, every muscle tense. The sound above him was deafening, a chaos of splitting wood, shattering glass, and the inhuman roar of the wind tearing through his world. The pressure dropped, making his ears ache. Dust sifted down from the ceiling, and the ground vibrated as though the storm was trying to dig him out. Up above, the tornado swallowed Ridgeview Lane. Roofs lifted like paper lids, spinning away into the night. Cars rolled down streets like toys. Fences vanished, trees snapped, and the sound of snapping power lines lit the air with flashes of electric blue. The perfect suburb that had prided itself on control was now a whirlpool of destruction, stripped of symmetry and order in a matter of minutes. The community hall, the pride of the HOA, the centerpiece of their neighborhood, was the first to go. Its wide glass windows exploded inward under the pressure, its roof peeled away, and its walls buckled. Inside, decorations and furniture were flung like confetti in the storm's wake. Those who had gathered there fled for cover, but there was nowhere to go. Ridgeview Lane had no real shelter, not anymore. The barn would have stood. Eli knew it. The reinforced foundation, the thick concrete walls. It would have endured the storm just as it had been built to. He could almost hear the memory of it, the creak of its old beams, the solid comfort of its shelter. But now, above him, there was only open air and ruin. The tornado carved a path directly through the center of the neighborhood, its vortex grinding everything into debris. It moved slowly, methodically, as if it had a purpose, as if it were searching for something. The sound grew lower, heavier, until it became more vibration than noise. Eli could feel it in his chest, in his bones. Minutes passed like hours. The air inside his cellar grew thin, and his flashlight flickered. He could hear objects smashing above, walls collapsing, bricks tumbling, his porch being ripped from its posts. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was gone. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. When Eli finally pushed open the cellar door, the air that met him was heavy with dust and the faint metallic scent of rain. The world had changed. Where his barn once stood, there was only a smooth, bare patch of earth, and beyond that, devastation as far as the eye could see. Every house on Ridgeview Lane was either flattened or ripped open. Trees were stripped bare, their trunks splintered and twisted. Cars lay upside down in ditches, their frames mangled beyond recognition. He climbed out slowly, his boots sinking into mud and insulation. The moonlight filtered through the shredded clouds, revealing what was left of the neighborhood. There was no laughter now. No manicured lawns. No perfect fences. Just silence and ruin. The HOA office, once so pristine with its polished sign and flower beds, was reduced to rubble. The sign lay half buried, its words fractured, Ridgeview Home, the rest swallowed by dirt. Eli walked the remains of the street, his flashlight beam cutting through the haze. Pieces of furniture were scattered everywhere. Photo frames, broken doors, pieces of someone's white picket fence. Everything looked the same in destruction. He reached the spot where his barn had once stood. The concrete foundation remained intact, smooth, solid, unbroken. Around it, nothing else stood. It was the only piece of structure that had resisted the storm. Irony burned in the air like ozone. The very foundation the HOA had deemed unsafe was the only thing left standing strong. Hours later, rescue sirens began to echo in the distance, faint at first, then louder as emergency teams began to arrive. The storm had moved on, carving a trail of devastation across 3 counties. The strongest tornado in decades, they would later call it. An F4, nearly a mile wide at its peak. As dawn crept over the horizon, the full extent of the destruction revealed itself. Ridgeview Lane was gone, nothing but debris and twisted remnants of what once was a model community. The residents, dazed and shivering, emerged from the wreckage. Some were injured, some in shock. Many looked lost, staring at where their homes once stood. Eli stood quietly at the edge of it all, his expression unreadable. Around him, people wept. Douglas Hale, the man who had ordered his barn demolished, sat in the mud, clutching the remains of a clipboard. The emblem of the HOA was still visible on its corner, smeared with dirt and rain. No one spoke. There were no excuses left to make. When news crews arrived later that morning, they filmed everything: the flattened homes, the splintered fences, the lone concrete foundation that stood like a monument to irony. Reporters interviewed survivors, capturing the disbelief and grief. But the camera always seemed to find its way back to that one foundation, the one piece of proof that not everything had fallen. Eli didn't seek attention. He simply stood by it, looking at the scarred earth and the ruins of the neighborhood that had tried to erase his past in the name of progress. The wind had done its job. Nature had made its point. And as the sun rose over the wreckage, Ridgeview Lane, once obsessed with beauty and order, became a cautionary tale whispered across the county. The barn they destroyed for safety had been the only thing that could have saved them. Dawn arrived reluctantly, as if even the sun hesitated to look upon what was left of Ridgeview Lane. The storm had passed, but it left behind a landscape unrecognizable, a canvas of ruin and silence. The neat rows of houses, the manicured lawns, the carefully maintained flower beds, all were gone, replaced by splinters, rubble, and twisted metal. The air smelled of mud, ozone, and heartbreak. A still fog hung low over the shattered neighborhood, softening the jagged edges of destruction but not the pain that lingered there. The only sounds were the faint cries of survivors and the distant hum of rescue vehicles slowly winding through debris-strewn roads. Eli Turner stood at the edge of his land, his boots coated in dirt and ash. His home was damaged but standing, windows blown out, roof half torn away, porch gone entirely. Yet compared to what surrounded him, it was a miracle. The rest of Ridgeview Lane lay flattened. Houses that had once stood proud under the HOA's watchful eye were now reduced to heaps of splintered timber. Cars were overturned and crushed, their alarms long silent. A child's swing set lay twisted around a tree trunk, its bright plastic dulled by mud. Eli looked toward where his barn used to be, or rather, the place where it had stood until Douglas Hale and his team destroyed it. The concrete foundation remained, untouched, solid, like an island in a sea of ruin. Around it, debris had piled up, but the foundation itself was uncracked, unyielding. It was almost defiant, a final statement that refused to be silenced. As the first responders moved in, the scene turned into a blur of motion. Search dogs combed the wreckage. Neighbors, dazed and barefoot, wandered aimlessly with blankets draped over their shoulders. The air was thick with disbelief. News crews soon arrived, their cameras sweeping across the devastation. Reporters spoke in solemn tones about one of the worst storms in recent memory and a community forever changed. Their microphones captured the confusion, the fear, and the grief. But inevitably, they found their way to Eli. Because standing behind him, unmistakable in every frame, was that lone foundation. Viewers watching from miles away noticed it immediately. Amid destruction that spared nothing else, that concrete slab stood pristine. When asked what it was, Eli told them simply, it had been a barn. One the HOA had torn down earlier that summer, claiming it was unsafe. The reporters didn't need him to say more. The image spoke louder than words ever could. The story spread faster than the storm itself. By afternoon, local news had become national coverage. Headlines flashed across television screens and social media feeds. The only structure left standing, HOA demolished barn that survived tornado. Man's unsafe shelter outlasts entire neighborhood. Karma or coincidence? Residents question HOA's priorities after disaster. Every camera angle, every drone shot captured the same haunting truth, the irony carved into the landscape. The barn, labeled a hazard, would have been the only safe place when the tornado hit. The HOA board, what was left of it, was in shambles. Douglas Hale sat on the tailgate of a rescue truck, wrapped in a blanket, staring blankly at the ruin of the street he once controlled. His perfectly combed hair was matted with dust, his hands trembling as he held what was left of his clipboard. Around him, his fellow board members avoided eye contact, each lost in their own spiral of regret. The camera crews caught him in the background of one shot, sitting just a few yards from the foundation of the barn he'd ordered destroyed. It became the defining image of the disaster. A symbol of arrogance meeting reality. Investigators arrived later that day to assess structural remains, to catalog what could be salvaged. When they reached Eli's foundation, one of them crouched and ran a hand along the smooth concrete. It was flawless. The inspector noted aloud that if reinforced walls had stood on that foundation, it would have easily survived the storm. That note made its way into the official report. By evening, the story had gone viral. News anchors replayed the footage, emphasizing the bitter irony. Talk shows discussed the dangers of HOA overreach. Online forums buzzed with outrage, thousands of comments pouring in from viewers who had their own stories of bureaucratic nonsense and misplaced priorities. They called it unsafe, and it's the only thing still standing. This is poetic justice. Nature doesn't care about your HOA rules. The public outrage grew so loud that the Ridgeview HOA effectively collapsed overnight. Several of its board members resigned, their reputations shredded by public scrutiny. The county opened an inquiry into the HOA's authority and its decision to order demolitions without structural evidence. Insurance companies began asking questions. Lawsuits loomed on the horizon. Through it all, Eli stayed silent. He didn't gloat. He didn't argue. He didn't even attend the emergency community meeting held in a borrowed school gym 2 towns over. He stayed home, what was left of it, quietly cleaning debris from his yard. Every so often, his eyes would drift to the concrete slab that once held his barn. There was no satisfaction in seeing he'd been right. Only a quiet sorrow for what could have been prevented. That night, as darkness fell again over Ridgeview Lane, the wind picked up once more, not violent, but gentle, moving through the ruins like a sigh. It carried the faint sound of loose shingles, the creak of broken fences, and something else, the faint hum of peace after chaos. The storm had done its job. It had erased everything false, leaving behind only what was real and strong enough to endure. Eli sat on his porch, listening to the wind whisper through what was left of the neighborhood. He thought about how the HOA had wanted uniformity, perfection, control. But nature had reminded them that nothing man-made stays perfect forever. And as the night deepened, the faint outline of that old foundation glowed pale under the moonlight, the last trace of something honest that never needed approval to exist. In the weeks that followed the storm, Ridgeview Lane existed only as a memory. What was once a polished emblem of suburban perfection was now nothing more than coordinates on a disaster map. A flattened patch of earth surrounded by silence and yellow caution tape. The HOA that had ruled every blade of grass, every mailbox color, every fence height was gone, dissolved not by legal decree, but by the unstoppable hand of nature. The county called it an act of God. But those who knew the story called it something else. They called it karma. News crews continued to arrive for days, documenting what was left of the neighborhood. Drone footage showed the full sweep of devastation, block after block of leveled homes, with one unmissable anomaly at the center, a square of concrete that stood untouched among the ruins. It was the foundation of Eli Turner's barn. It became a symbol. Journalists stood beside it as they spoke of resilience, irony, and arrogance. Commentators debated on national television about the overreach of homeowners associations, about how bureaucracy had replaced common sense, about the way one man's quiet defiance had unintentionally become an act of poetic justice. Eli's phone rang constantly. Reporters wanted interviews. Documentarians wanted footage. Insurance companies wanted statements. He declined them all. He had no interest in fame or revenge. He had lived long enough to understand that real justice didn't always come from courts or headlines. Sometimes it came from the wind. Meanwhile, the Ridgeview HOA board disintegrated in full public view. Douglas Hale, once so proud and commanding, became the unwilling face of the disaster. Every news clip replayed the same photo of him, sitting on the ground, covered in dust, staring at the foundation of the barn he'd destroyed. It went viral across social media platforms, often captioned with biting irony. They said it was unsafe. The safest place in town. Mother Nature's audit report. Under mounting pressure, the HOA filed for dissolution. Lawsuits emerged, not from Eli, but from residents who lost everything and blamed the board's decisions for leaving them without proper shelters. Emails and meeting records surfaced, showing how Douglas and the board had dismissed multiple safety recommendations in favor of aesthetics. The public outrage was merciless. The once respected local figure who had demanded uniform fences and approved flower colors was now a pariah. News outlets reported that Douglas had moved out of town, unable to bear the attention or the guilt. Eli never saw him again. When the government relief teams finally cleared the area for rebuilding, they found something unusual about Eli's land. The soil beneath the barn's foundation had barely shifted. Its construction had been so deep and solid that it had resisted the storm's full force. One official noted, almost reverently, that if the barn had still stood, it could have sheltered dozens. That note became part of the state's emergency report. By the second month, Ridgeview Lane had turned into a kind of local legend. People drove by to see the empty space where the neighborhood once stood. Some left flowers. Others simply stood in silence. The story had spread far beyond the county, a viral modern parable about control, pride, and the cost of ignoring wisdom. Eli didn't rebuild the barn. He couldn't bring himself to. To him, the foundation was no longer a base for something new. It was a gravestone, a memorial to what was lost and what was proven. He spent his days helping others clear debris, volunteering for cleanup crews, using the skills he'd learned from a lifetime of self-reliance. While others saw ruins, he saw renewal. The land, stripped bare by the wind, had a kind of purity to it now. The clutter was gone. So was the pretense. One morning, a news drone hovered above, filming a segment about recovery. Its camera captured Eli standing alone beside the foundation, wind ruffling his jacket, his shadow stretching long across the slab. That image became the final frame of a documentary special, a symbol of humility and endurance in the face of arrogance. In interviews with survivors, they all mentioned the same thing, the irony of the barn. They spoke of how they'd mocked it once, how they'd signed letters calling for its removal, how they'd stood by while the HOA tore it down. Every one of them admitted that when the tornado came, they thought of that barn. Some couldn't finish the sentence. The county offered Eli funding to rebuild, even proposing a memorial on the site to commemorate the tragedy. He refused both. He wanted the land to remain as it was, a reminder, unpolished and real. By early autumn, grass began to grow through the cracks in the concrete. The fields beyond turned gold again. Birds returned. Nature moved forward, unbothered by human pride or property lines. Eli often sat there at dusk, watching the light fade across the plain. The world had moved on. Reporters had found new stories, the lawsuits dragged on in distant courtrooms, and Ridgeview Lane faded from the headlines. But for those who had lived there, the story never ended. It became a quiet cautionary tale passed through conversations, told with a kind of reverent disbelief. They would say, there was a man who built something strong, and they tore it down because it didn't look right. And then they would pause before adding, when the storm came, his foundation was the only thing that stood. Eli didn't need to tell that story himself. The world had already told it for him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a gentle breeze rolled across the land, not angry, not vengeful, just calm. The grass bent and swayed, whispering across the foundation like an echo from the past. The wind had done its job, and it had left behind the truth. Months passed, and the memory of the storm began to fade from the headlines. News vans stopped coming. The county finished its reports. The lawsuits dragged on, buried under paperwork and legal jargon. Ridgeview Lane, once a model of suburban order, became a ghost neighborhood, a flattened field marked only by empty lots and scattered remnants of foundations half buried beneath overgrown weeds. But one foundation remained clear and clean, never swallowed by time. Eli Turner kept it that way. He didn't rebuild his barn, nor his porch, nor even his fences. He rebuilt only what was necessary to live: the roof, the walls, the essentials. The rest he left to the wind. The seasons changed around him. Spring came first, soft and green, the air carrying the smell of wet soil and rebirth. Wildflowers sprouted along the edges of the old foundation, their colors bright against the dull gray concrete. Birds nested in the nearby trees, and rabbits darted through the tall grass. The land, cleansed by destruction, began to heal itself. Eli moved slower now. The storm had taken much, but it had given something back too: clarity. The barn, the HOA, the rules, the endless pursuit of control, all of it seemed small compared to the truth that nature had etched into the earth. He often sat by the foundation at dusk, the same time the tornado had first touched down months ago. The wind would rise like clockwork, rolling gently across the plains. It carried no threat now, only whispers. Some evenings it was so soft he could almost believe the barn was still there, standing strong and unbroken, its beams creaking quietly in the breeze. The neighborhood never returned. The county declared the area unsuitable for dense housing. Too exposed, they said. Too dangerous. The survivors took their insurance payouts and moved elsewhere, spreading to safer towns, quieter places. Ridgeview Lane became a story people told, a cautionary tale about arrogance, bureaucracy, and how far humans will go to control what they should simply respect. Eli didn't leave. He stayed because this was still his home. It had been his long before the HOA existed, and it would be his long after their rules turned to dust. Every so often, a car would stop by the edge of the old road. Strangers would step out, looking at the empty stretch of land, phones in hand, whispering to one another. They'd take photos of the concrete slab, the only visible reminder of what once stood here. Some left flowers. Others just stood in silence, listening to the wind move through the tall grass. It was as if the place had become sacred, a memorial not to tragedy, but to truth. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Eli stood barefoot on the cool surface of the foundation. The light stretched long shadows across the concrete, painting it gold. The air was still at first, heavy and warm, and then, slowly, the wind rose again. It moved across the plain with the same deep, low hum that had once signaled destruction. But this time, it was different. It was gentler, like a voice made of memory. He closed his eyes and let it wash over him. He could almost hear the echoes of the past, the laughter of his father working in the barn, the sound of rain on the old tin roof, the distant thunder of storms that had come and gone. The wind carried all of it, folding it into a single, endless breath. And beneath that sound, there was something else, a lesson, unspoken but unmistakable. That strength isn't always seen in what stands tall, but in what endures after everything else falls. The barn had endured in its own way. Even gone, it remained, not as wood or stone, but as a truth carved into the soil. Some things are built to last, even when no one believes they should. Later that year, a storm rolled in again. Smaller, harmless, passing across the plains with a few rumbles of thunder and flashes of distant lightning. Eli watched it from his porch, calm and unafraid. When the rain reached him, it fell softly, cleansing rather than breaking. The drops hissed as they hit the old foundation, darkening the concrete, running through cracks filled with moss. For a moment, the surface gleamed like it was new again. Then the rain passed and the night went still. In the moonlight, the slab shone pale and silent, like a monument carved by the wind itself. It didn't need plaques or names. Everyone who had ever heard the story already knew what it meant. Eli stood there for a while longer, then turned toward his home. Behind him, the wind shifted once more, picking up speed just enough to carry a whisper through the grass, a low, steady murmur that sounded almost like words. You were right to build strong. He smiled faintly, though no one saw it. The world had moved on, but the wind still remembered. And as it swept across Ridgeview Lane, now just open land and scattered memories, it carried with it the quiet truth that no one could bury, no matter how hard they tried. They had demolished his barn for safety. But in the end, the wind had done its job. And it had left the truth standing.